Every avoidant has to face this feeling where all the carefully constructed narratives, all the "I'm better off" stories, all the strategic distance and deliberate forgetting, all the convincing themselves that what they had wasn't actually that significant, all of it starts to crumble. And what's left beneath the rubble isn't relief or peace or the clean slate they've been desperately trying to create. What's left is the full, unfiltered, devastating weight of everything they pushed away, everything they refused to feel, everything they systematically dismantled through their withdrawal and their coldness and their inability to stay present with someone who was offering them exactly what their wounded heart desperately needed but could never admit to needing. The avoidant person couldn't forget you. They tried. They tried with everything they had, tried to move on, tried to convince themselves you weren't that important, tried to find replacement for what you provided, tried to fill the space you occupied with activity and distraction and new connections that never quite reached the depth yours did. And none of it worked. Not because they weren't trying hard enough or weren't committed enough to moving forward, but because what you represented in their life wasn't something that could be replaced through effort or time or willpower. You represented something they'd never encountered before and might never encounter again. Someone who saw through every defense and loved what they found there. Someone who stayed when staying required more patience than most people possess. Someone who understood their wounds without making those wounds the center of every interaction. Someone who offered safety so genuine and so consistent that even their most defended parts began to soften in your presence. And now they're facing it. Not by choice. The avoidant never faces painful truth by choice. They face it because the alternative, the continued pretending, the ongoing performance of being fine, has become more exhausting than the truth itself. The energy required to maintain the fiction that you didn't matter, that the relationship wasn't significant, that they're perfectly content with the life they chose over you, this energy has been depleted. And in the depletion, in the moment where they simply cannot maintain the performance any longer, the truth arrives with full force. They lost something extraordinary. They lost you. And they're finally, painfully, inescapably facing exactly what that loss means. The specific things they couldn't stop thinking about, no matter how hard they tried. Before the full confrontation with what they lost arrived, there were specific things, persistent, uninvited, impossible to silence thoughts and memories that kept surfacing despite every strategy the avoidant employed to suppress them. These recurring intrusions reveal what about you and what about the relationship refused to be buried regardless of how desperately they tried to bury it. They couldn't stop thinking about how you made them feel safe in ways they never felt safe before. Not safe from external danger, but safe from themselves, safe from the internal chaos of their own fear and their own wounds and their own contradictory needs. In every other relationship, every other interaction, they were constantly managing their internal landscape, monitoring their fear, regulating their withdrawal impulse, calculating how much closeness was tolerable. With you, something shifted. The constant internal vigilance quieted. Not completely. The avoidance system never fully quiets, but enough that they could breathe. Enough that moments existed where they weren't actively defending against the relationship, but were simply being in it. This specific feeling of internal quiet, this reduction in the constant psychological labor of managing their own fear, was something they couldn't stop returning to in memory, because nothing else they've experienced since has created it. The safety you provided wasn't about what you did or said specifically. It was about who you were and how your presence affected their nervous system. And this physiological safety is something their body remembers, even when their mind tries to forget. They couldn't stop replaying specific conversations where you understood something about them that no one else had ever understood, Moments where you named what they were feeling before they could name it themselves, where you saw the fear beneath the withdrawal, where you identified the wound driving the behavior without making them feel pathetic or broken for having that wound. These conversations haunted them because they represented something they'd never experienced, being truly comprehended by another person. Most people in the avoidance life respond to their patterns with frustration or confusion or eventual abandonment. You responded with understanding that felt almost supernatural in its accuracy, as if you could see directly into the parts of them they kept hidden from everyone. The memory of being that understood, that accurately perceived, that genuinely comprehended, this memory refused to fade because it represented experience so rare that no subsequent interaction could replace or diminish it. They kept returning to it because it was proof that someone once saw them completely, and that proof is both precious and painful to hold. They couldn't stop thinking about the way you looked at them during moments of genuine connection, not the polite looking of casual acquaintance or the appraising looking of someone evaluating whether relationship is worth continuing, but the looking of someone who genuinely saw them and found what they saw worthy of love. This specific quality of being looked at, being witnessed with warmth and acceptance and genuine regard, created feeling they couldn't replicate anywhere else in their life. They looked at themselves in mirrors and saw a person they were uncertain about. They received looks from friends and colleagues that communicated various things: respect, affection, professional regard, but none that communicated what yours did. You are seen, you are known, you are loved for exactly who you are, including the parts you wish you could hide. This memory of your looking persisted because it answered questions they've been asking themselves their entire life. Am I lovable as I actually am, not as I perform to be? And your looking answered yes in ways words never could have. They couldn't stop returning to moments where you chose them over your own comfort, where you stayed present during their difficult behavior when leaving would have been justified and healthier for you. They remembered specific instances: the night you stayed when they were cold and distant and giving you nothing emotionally, the morning you showed up with warmth after days of their withdrawal, the conversation where you expressed hurt but chose to stay rather than protect yourself by leaving. Each of these moments represented something extraordinary, someone choosing them despite them giving that someone every reason not to choose them. The persistence of these memories revealed something the avoidance defenses couldn't suppress: gratitude. Deep, uncomfortable, destabilizing gratitude for someone who gave them more than they deserved and did it freely and consistently and without making them feel guilty for receiving it. They couldn't stop thinking about the future they glimpsed with you, not future they consciously planned or explicitly discussed, but future that existed in the background of their awareness, the life that was quietly becoming possible simply through sustained connection with you. They saw themselves in that future without meaning to, saw the apartment you might share, the mornings that would accumulate into years, the ordinary life that becomes extraordinary simply because it's shared with right person. This glimpsed future haunted them because it was the first time in their life they'd seen a future that felt genuinely desirable rather than genuinely terrifying, and losing access to that future through their own behavior meant losing the first glimpse of happiness they'd ever allowed themselves to have. They couldn't stop noticing the silence where your presence used to be. Not physical silence, but emotional silence. The absence of the specific warmth and understanding and seeing that characterized your presence in their life. This emotional silence followed them everywhere, into conversations with friends where no one understood them the way you did, into evenings alone where no one's presence created the specific quality of comfort yours did, into new connections that felt hollow compared to the depth yours possessed. The silence wasn't absence of noise, it was absence of being known, and this absence was louder than anything else in their life because it contrasted so starkly with the richness of what existed when you were present. They couldn't stop thinking about the specific way you loved them, not dramatically or with grand gestures, but quietly, consistently, persistently, with patience that seemed inexhaustible and with understanding that seemed bottomless. This quality of loving, steady and warm and present and forgiving, was so different from anything they'd experienced that it created specific impression that no subsequent experience could overwrite. They kept returning to it because it represented proof that the kind of love they feared didn't exist actually did exist, and that it existed specifically with them, specifically offered by you, and they destroyed it through the very fear that made them doubt it could exist. What happens inside them when they finally stop running from the truth? The moment the avoidant stops running, stops maintaining the performance, stops constructing the narratives, stops pretending the loss doesn't matter, specific psychological processes unfold that are painful, but are also potentially the first genuine movement toward healing they've experienced since the relationship ended. Understanding what happens when they finally face the truth reveals the significance of this moment. The first thing that happens is grief arrives with force that has been building behind the dam of their defenses for months or years. They've been managing their emotional response to losing you through compartmentalization, pushing the feelings into box they don't open, maintaining functioning by refusing to feel the full weight of what they lost. When the dam finally breaks, when they stop holding back the grief, it arrives with intensity proportional to how long they've been suppressing it. This grief is enormous because it's not just grief for you. It's grief for the life they could have had. Grief for the person they could have been if they'd been brave enough to stay. Grief for every moment they wasted defending against the very thing that would have made them happiest. The grief is consuming and overwhelming, and for a period it makes normal functioning difficult because they're feeling, for the first time, the full emotional weight of what they destroyed. This is painful, but it's also necessary. Grief that's suppressed never heals, and the suppression they've maintained has prevented any genuine processing of the loss. The second thing that happens is they confront their own role with clarity that's impossible to rationalize away. When they were actively defending against the truth, they could maintain partial narratives. The relationship wasn't right. We wanted different things. I needed space I couldn't get. These narratives distributed responsibility or attributed loss to circumstance rather than to their own choices. When they stopped defending, when they faced truth directly, these narratives collapse, and what remains is clear-eyed recognition. They did this. Their fear drove every choice that led to this loss. Their patterns created every problem that made the relationship unsustainable. Their withdrawal, their coldness, their inability to be present. These were choices, not circumstances, and their consequences are permanent. This confrontation with their own responsibility is deeply uncomfortable and creates shame that's difficult to sit with. But it's also the prerequisite for any genuine change, because change requires honest acknowledgement of what needs to change and why. The third thing that happens is they begin to understand with painful precision exactly what you meant to them, not in abstract general terms, but in specific concrete ways that reveal the depth of your impact on their life. They understand you were the person who made them feel less alone in their own mind. They understand you were the person whose acceptance made their own self-acceptance possible in moments. They understand you were the person who showed them that being known didn't have to be terrifying, that someone could see all of them and not leave. They understand you were the person who made their life genuinely better in ways they couldn't appreciate while it was happening, because they were too busy defending against the intimacy that was making it better. This specific understanding, concrete, detailed, undeniable, is what makes the confrontation with loss so devastating. It's not vague sadness about relationship ending. It's precise recognition of exactly what each specific thing you provided meant to them and exactly how profoundly its absence affects their life. The fourth thing that happens is they begin to see their patterns not as protective mechanisms, but as destructive forces that have systematically eliminated every opportunity for the life they actually want. This shift in perception from "my patterns protect me" to "my patterns destroy everything I want" is revolutionary and destabilizing because it challenges the foundational belief their entire psychological architecture is built on. They've believed their withdrawal protected them. They've believed their distance kept them safe. They've believed their independence prevented the pain that vulnerability would create. But facing what they lost reveals these beliefs as catastrophically wrong. Their patterns didn't protect them from pain. They created the worst pain they've ever experienced by destroying the relationship that was preventing that pain from existing. This recognition doesn't automatically change the patterns, but it does create the possibility of change because it eliminates the justification that maintained them. The fifth thing that happens is they feel, possibly for the first time, genuine motivation to become different. Not to win you back necessarily, but to become a person capable of sustaining what you offered, because they now understand what they were incapable of sustaining, and they understand the cost of that incapacity. This motivation is significant because previously, any motivation to change was external. Change to keep relationship. Change because you asked them to. Change to avoid losing you. Now, the motivation is internal. Change because they've seen what their inability to change costs them, and they cannot bear to lose something this significant again. Whether this internal motivation is sufficient to drive sustained therapeutic work remains uncertain. Motivation created by pain sometimes fades as pain becomes more manageable. But in this moment, in this confrontation with loss, the desire to be different is genuine and powerful and represents first real crack in the defended structure that has prevented growth. Why this confrontation with what they lost is both the most painful and most important moment they've experienced. The avoidance confrontation with the truth about what they lost creates paradox, where the most painful experience they're currently having is simultaneously the most important experience they've had in years. Understanding why pain and importance converge in this moment reveals the significance of what's occurring. The confrontation is most painful because it eliminates every protective story simultaneously, leaving them exposed to truth without any buffer. For months or years they've had narratives, stories that softened the blow, that distributed responsibility, that made loss feel manageable. In this moment, all narratives have collapsed. There's no story left. There's just truth. They had an extraordinary person who loved them, and they destroyed that love through their own fear. And now that person is gone, and the loss is permanent, and it's entirely their fault. The absence of any protective narrative makes the pain acute in ways that buffered pain never was. There's nothing between them and the full weight of what happened. Nothing to soften impact, nothing to make it more bearable. They're feeling it completely for first time, and feeling it completely is devastating. The confrontation is most important because it's the first moment where genuine change becomes possible. Every previous moment where they recognized something was wrong, every previous moment where they felt guilt or regret, these moments were quickly followed by return to defended position because the truth was too painful to sustain, and defenses activated to manage the pain. But this confrontation feels different. The defenses have been weakened by the accumulated weight of evidence, the persistent inability to forget you, the consistent failure to find replacement, the growing clarity that defended life is actually more painful than vulnerable life would have been. The defenses are weakened enough that truth might sustain longer than it has before, might create enough sustained discomfort that they actually seek help rather than simply returning to defended position and waiting for pain to subside. This is the moment where therapy becomes not just logical choice but felt necessity, where the gap between who they are and who they need to become feels too large to bridge without professional help. The confrontation is painful because it reveals the full scope of what they've been missing, not just in relationship with you, but in their entire life. The patterns that destroyed the relationship with you didn't begin with you. They began decades earlier, in their childhood, in their early relationships, in every connection they've had, where fear prevented them from being fully present. Facing what they lost with you means facing what they have lost everywhere, what they've prevented themselves from experiencing throughout their entire life, what their fear has systematically eliminated from their existence. The grief isn't just for you. It's for every version of connection they've been incapable of sustaining, every relationship they've damaged through the same patterns, every moment of genuine intimacy they've fled from. You're the most painful loss because you were the most significant, but you're not the only loss, and facing your loss opens door to facing all the others. The confrontation is important because it creates possibility that their relationship with themselves changes, not just their relationship with others, but their fundamental understanding of who they are and what they're capable of. If they choose to do the work, if they use this pain as catalyst for genuine therapeutic engagement, the person who emerges on other side won't be the same defended person who destroyed the relationship with you. They'll be a person who understands their wounds, who has developed tools for managing fear without running from intimacy, who has built capacity for vulnerability they previously lacked entirely. This transformation isn't guaranteed and isn't automatic. It requires sustained effort and genuine willingness to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. But the possibility exists now in ways it didn't exist before this confrontation, because this confrontation has created the felt necessity that might actually motivate the work. The confrontation is painful and important simultaneously because it represents the moment where the avoidance life divides into before and after. Before this moment, they could maintain fiction that they were fine, that the loss didn't matter, that their defended life was sufficient. After this moment, that fiction is permanently destroyed. They cannot go back to believing they're fine. They know too clearly now that they're not. They cannot pretend the loss doesn't matter. They feel its weight too completely. They cannot maintain that defended life is sufficient. They've seen too clearly that it's actually the most insufficient life possible. This before and after division means something fundamental has shifted in their psychological landscape, and whether that shift leads to growth or to deeper defense is the question that will determine the trajectory of their life going forward. What they're finally facing what they lost actually means for you and your peace. The avoidance confrontation with the truth about what they lost has specific implications for how you understand your own experience, for how you process your own healing, and for how you relate to the situation going forward. Understanding what they're facing means for you helps you find peace that doesn't depend on their journey, but is informed by it. Their confrontation means the relationship meant what you felt it meant. The significance you experienced was real and mutual, and not something you imagined or inflated through your own investment. This confirmation serves your healing by eliminating the lingering doubt that often accompanies loss when the other person's feelings weren't clearly communicated. You don't need to wonder anymore whether you were alone in what you felt. You weren't. The relationship was significant to both of you. Their inability to sustain it wasn't evidence it wasn't meaningful. It was evidence they couldn't handle how meaningful it was. This distinction matters for your peace because it reframes the loss from they didn't care enough to they cared too much and couldn't manage what caring that much required of them. Both framings are painful, but the second one honors the reality of what existed between you rather than diminishing it. Their confrontation means you can release the specific pain of wondering whether they ever understood what they did to you, because they understand now, fully, painfully, completely. Part of your own suffering after the relationship ended might have included frustration about whether they even recognized the impact of their behavior, whether they understood what they destroyed, whether they saw you clearly enough to grasp the significance of what they lost. They see it now. They understand completely. The confrontation they're having is specifically about this understanding, about seeing clearly what they did and what it cost and what you meant. This doesn't erase your pain or speed your healing, but it does eliminate the specific suffering of feeling unseen or unrecognized in the significance of your loss. They see it. They know. Their confrontation means you don't need to wait for them to reach out or express regret or seek forgiveness before you can find peace with what happened. Their internal confrontation is occurring regardless of whether it ever becomes visible to you. They might never tell you what they're feeling. They might never reach out. They might process this entirely internally without ever communicating it directly. But it's happening. The facing is real even if you never witness it. And knowing it's happening, knowing they're confronting truth about what they lost, even without your being present to witness that confrontation, can provide some of the closure that direct communication would provide. You don't need their words to know they understand. You can trust that the facing is occurring based on the psychological trajectory that inevitably leads to this confrontation when someone destroys something genuinely significant through their own patterns. Their confrontation means the most powerful position you can occupy isn't one that's focused on them at all, but is one that's focused entirely on your own life and your own future. They're facing what they lost. You can honor that reality while simultaneously building the life that doesn't require their acknowledgement or their growth or their eventual transformation to be extraordinary. Their confrontation is their journey. Your peace is yours. The two exist independently. His facing what he lost doesn't change what you do next, doesn't determine whether your life is fulfilling, doesn't affect whether you find love that doesn't require the painful education theirs required. Move forward. Build. Love. Live. Their confrontation with loss happens in parallel to your movement forward, and both journeys have value, but your journey is the only one you can control, and the only one that determines the quality of your life. They're finally facing what they lost ultimately means the universe has delivered the consequence that enforced the boundary you set when you left. You enforced boundary by leaving, by communicating through your departure that their behavior was unacceptable and that you deserved better. Their confrontation with what they lost is the consequence that arrived from that boundary. Boundaries work not by immediately changing the other person, but by creating consequences that eventually force confrontation with the cost of their behavior. Your leaving created the consequence. Their confrontation is the result. Whether they use this consequence productively, whether it leads to genuine growth, is beyond your control. But the boundary worked. The consequence arrived. The facing is happening. And this means your decision to protect yourself wasn't just about your immediate well-being. It was about creating the conditions where their confrontation with truth became possible. You didn't just save yourself. You created the only situation where they might save themselves. And that, the knowledge that your self-protection also created possibility for their growth, is itself a form of peace. Not peace that depends on their transformation, not peace that requires their acknowledgement, but peace that comes from knowing you acted with integrity that your boundaries served both of you, that the facing they're finally doing was made possible by the courage you showed in leaving. They couldn't forget you. They're finally facing what they lost. And you already faced it. You faced it when you left. You faced it when you chose yourself. You faced it long before they did, and that facing is why you're already healing, while they're only now beginning. The avoidant couldn't forget you, because you were unforgettable. Not because of anything dramatic or exceptional in the way most people understand exceptional, but because of the quiet, consistent, profound way you loved someone who made loving them genuinely difficult. And because that kind of love leaves mark that no amount of time or distance or defensive narrative can erase. They're facing it now, and you can let them face it while you continue becoming the person you were always becoming. Whole, healed, worthy of love that doesn't require years of painful education to be appreciated. You were always that person. They're only now beginning to understand it. But you knew, and your knowing was always enough.